London, midnight. The fog was thick enough to swallow sound, and yet, through the mist, a single breath broke the silence. Soft, uneasy, human. Then, gone. Vanished, as if the night itself had taken it. When the constable arrived, there was no sign of struggle, no cry for help, only the faint scent of tobacco and a trail of smoke curling through the air. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Sherlock Holmes, it was the beginning of a puzzle written in air, a moment so brief it almost escaped reality. Because sometimes the truth doesn't leave fingerprints. It leaves a breath that shouldn't have disappeared. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this make your heart race, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because every case here pulls you deeper into the fog of Baker Street. Now, pick up your cup of tea, take a slow breath, and let's follow the smoke together. This is Sherlock Holmes and the breath that vanished in smoke. Chapter 1. The shadow found in a photograph. It was on a bleak March morning, gray as unburnished steel, that I found Sherlock Holmes seated at the breakfast table of our Baker Street lodgings, his long fingers poised above a curling photograph and a faint scowl etched beneath the sharp arch of his brows. The fire crackled low. A thin mist clung to the window pane. I had just set down the latest edition of the Times, expecting the usual silence to prevail before Holmes launched into some unexpected observation regarding the Post or the weather in Constantinople. Instead, he spoke at once, his tone flat but alert. "Tell me, Watson," he said, passing the photograph across the table with 2 fingers. "What do you make of that?" I studied the image, expecting some visual puzzle. It was an ordinary-looking group portrait, 6 people posed stiffly before a wrought-iron gate, likely at a private garden or estate. 3 gentlemen in morning coats, 2 ladies in spring bonnets, and a little girl in a pinafore holding a doll. A late afternoon sun cast sharp shadows behind them, throwing their silhouettes onto the paving stones. "I see a family gathering," I offered. "Perhaps a garden party. No uniforms, no signs of distress. Pleasant expressions, save perhaps the man on the far right. He looks a little tight-lipped." Holmes gave a sound that was not quite a hum. "You are, as ever, observant but not yet surgical in your analysis." He tapped the photograph. "Do you see the shadow here? Beside the girl." I leaned closer. Behind the child was a distinctly human-shaped shadowette. There was no one beside her. Her own shadow was cast clearly to the left, but this second form, slightly taller, leaned over her from the right, as though whispering something inaudible into her ear. It was not a trick of light. The angle was wrong, the positioning unnatural. "Good Lord," I murmured. "There's no one standing there yet. The shadow is unmistakable." Holmes leaned back. "Precisely." He reached into his dressing gown and produced a small note, folded crisply. "This was delivered an hour ago," he said. "Read it." I opened the note. It was written in a tight, elegant hand, trembling just slightly at the edges. "Mr. Holmes, I do not ask you to believe in ghosts. I only ask that you look at this photograph and tell me what you see. My sister believes the image is cursed and that something terrible is going to happen. I am less superstitious, but I fear she may be right." Edgar Tilburn Holmes rose from his seat and strode toward the hearth, clasping his hands behind his back. "Edgar Tilburn," he said thoughtfully. "A name that rings faint bells. third son of the late Lord Harrogate, if I am not mistaken. Did a stint in the diplomatic service, retired young, and by some scandal, though I cannot immediately recall the nature of it. He turned toward me. I do not believe in ghosts, Watson, but I do believe in the persistence of guilt. Something unnatural occurred during the taking of this image, not supernatural, mind you, but deliberate, and I suspect we shall soon learn more than we wish about the Tilburn family. Just then, there came a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson opened it a moment later to reveal a tall, thin man in a dark blue overcoat, hat in hand. His face pale and taut with unease. He asked, "I am Edgar Tilburn. Thank you for seeing me." Holmes extended a hand. "Come in, Mr. Tilburn. We've been studying your photograph with interest. Sit, please. Would you care to explain how this image came to be in your possession?" Tilburn nodded, his fingers twitching as he sat. "It was taken 3 weeks ago, at my family's estate. We had gathered to celebrate my niece Emily's 8th birthday. That's her in the center, with the doll. It was a pleasant afternoon. Nothing unusual occurred until the photograph was developed." He swallowed. "My sister Clara was the first to notice the shadow beside Emily. She became hysterical, said it was our late brother, Stephen." "Your deceased brother's shadow," Holmes repeated quietly. "Stephen died in a boating accident 2 years ago. He and Emily were close, but the resemblance, the shape of the shadow, the tilt of the head, it is uncanny. Even I admit it." Watson leaned forward. "But surely that can be explained, some optical misfire, a double exposure." "I thought the same," Tilburn said. "But the photographer, a professional we hired from London, swore it was a single clean plate, no flaws. And since that day, well, strange things have begun happening at the house. Rooms disturbed, doors left open, and Emily," his voice faltered, "she's begun talking to someone who isn't there." A hush fell over the room. Holmes, for once, said nothing. "I am not a fanciful man, Mr. Holmes," Tilburn went on, "but I cannot shake the feeling that something followed us home, or that someone alive or not is using this to terrify my family." Holmes's eyes narrowed. He walked to the window, gazing out into the London fog. "Double quotes, Mr. Tilburn," he said softly. "I do not yet know what haunts your house, but I suspect the shadow in that photograph is neither ghost nor accident. It is a message." He turned abruptly. "Watson, pack your bag. We are going to Surrey." Chapter 2. A visit to Tilburn Grove. It was scarcely past midday when Holmes and I stepped down from the train at the modest station of Guildford, our boots crunching against the gravel as a cutting wind swept through the countryside. Mr. Tilburn met us on the platform with a polite nod, and a face that had not shed the tension from our earlier meeting. "This way, gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward a waiting carriage with his gloved hand. "It's a short ride to the house." The landscape was quiet and bare. Hedgerows stripped 2 brittle fingers, and the trees bent slightly under a graying sky. Holmes said little during the journey. His gaze fixed out the window, fingers steepled beneath his chin in silent contemplation. I knew better than to interrupt such moments. His mind, I had learned, often unraveled knots faster in silence than in speech. As the carriage turned up a gravel drive lined with yew trees, Tilburn Grove emerged into view, a proud but fading country estate with ivy crawling hungrily across its stone facade and leaded windows half veiled by the fog. The place had an air of melancholic dignity, as though clinging to its own past with stubborn elegance. A butler opened the great oak door with a solemn nod. "Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes," Tilburn announced, leading us into a high-ceilinged foyer. The air was cool and faintly tinged with the scent of old books and lavender polish. "My sister Clara is upstairs with Emily," he said. "I thought it best not to tell her of your immediate arrival. She's become fragile since the matter of the photograph." Holmes merely inclined his head. "Is the photograph still here?" "Of course." Tilburn led us into a sitting room whose tall windows overlooked the garden. Upon a side table, beside a framed sketch of the late Lord Harrogate, rested the image we had already studied in Baker Street. Holmes moved to it without delay. This time he requested a magnifying lens from his coat pocket and spent several silent minutes inspecting the photograph, again pausing not only on the shadow in question but on the shoes of the man on the far left, the folds of the lady's dress, the cast of the sunlight across the paving stones. "Have any of the other family members seen this shadow?" Holmes asked, without turning his head. "Myself, Clara, and Miss Perkins, our housemaid," Tilburn replied. "We were the first to see it. The others, they dismissed it as a trick. But Miss Perkins—" Holmes turned now, his expression sharpening. "She did not dismiss it." Tilburn looked uncomfortable. "No, she left the house the very next day." Holmes's eyes lit momentarily. "Ah." I stepped forward. "Do you happen to know where she went?" Tilburn nodded. "Back to her family in Portsmouth. I've written, but she hasn't replied. She was very fond of Emily. Her sudden departure struck us all." Holmes stood upright. A woman leaving her position without notice is often a clue in itself. "Has Emily said anything else besides speaking to someone who isn't there?" Tilburn hesitated. "She's become more withdrawn. She no longer plays in the garden. She barely eats. And twice now she's been found asleep in the West Hall, curled on the floor outside Stephen's old study. Was she ever close to her late uncle?" "Yes," Tilburn said quietly. "Stephen was rather more indulgent than the rest of us. He used to let her stay up late, told her stories about pirates and faraway lands. They were often together before the accident." Holmes glanced at me, then returned his attention to Tilburn. "And the study, has it been disturbed?" "No one goes in," Tilburn said. "We left it untouched after his passing," Clara insisted. "I should like to see it," Holmes said, already moving toward the door. "Watson, come." We followed Tilburn up the curving staircase and down a long corridor lined with portraits, the faces of ancestors gazing down in still judgment. At the far end, a door stood shut with a faded tassel on the handle. Tilburn opened it with a small brass key and stood back. The room was dim, untouched by time. Books lined the shelves in precise order, dust thick on their spines. A large desk stood before a shuttered window, its surface still holding a blotter, an inkwell dried to crust, and a half-open drawer, revealing a sheaf of correspondence tied with black ribbon. Holmes moved like a shadow through the space, lifting items gently, brushing dust with a finger, tilting his head as though listening for echoes. "He was right-handed," Holmes murmured suddenly. "Stephen?" Tilburn asked, puzzled. "Yes, that's correct." Then why is the blotter stained predominantly on the left? Ink smudged outward, as though drawn by a left-handed wrist. Odd. He moved toward the fireplace and knelt. A stack of yellowing newspapers lay beside it, most dating to 2 years ago, the time of Stephen's death. Holmes picked one up, rifled through the pages, and paused. "Watson," he said, handing it to me. The obituary column, there, among a list of names, was one that had been circled in pencil: Gerald P. Mallory, aged 47, died of a sudden illness at his London residence. Survived by wife and son. Beneath the entry was scrawled a faint notation, March 2nd. Finally, I frowned. "Does the name mean anything to you?" Tilburn was staring at the page with narrowed eyes. Gerald Mallory. I believe he was a solicitor. He handled some of Father's land transfers in '89. But why would Stephen mark this? Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned, his voice low. "Because Stephen may have had unfinished business with Mr. Mallory. And perhaps what haunts this house is not his ghost but a secret he took with him to the grave." A creak echoed down the corridor light. Childlike, all three of us turned. Standing at the end of the hall, half in shadow, was a little girl in a pale blue dress. Her eyes were wide, her face blank. "Emily." Tilburn called softly, but she didn't answer. Instead, she raised her right hand and pointed past us, into the darkened study. Holmes stepped forward, slowly. "Who were you just speaking to, Emily?" he asked. The girl tilted her head. "Uncle Stephen," she whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Holmes stood still for a long time, the silence pressing in around him like fog. "Watson," he said finally, "I believe we are dealing not with a haunting, but with a message from the dead encoded in fear, preserved in silence. And someone in this house already knows what it means." Chapter 3. The First Clues. A Scene of Deception. The next morning broke with a heavy fog that seemed to settle not only over the landscape, but over the very atmosphere of Tilburn Grove itself. I found Holmes, already awake, seated at the writing desk in our guest room, with the photograph laid out before him once more. The morning light barely penetrating the gray veil that pressed against the window. He was tracing something faint in the image with a slender instrumenta needle-pointed stylus of sorts. At the sound of my stirring, he looked up with that curious glint that only emerged when he stood at the edge of a revelation. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is a lie hidden in plain view, as there so often is. Come here." I joined him, still groggy, but curious. "You see this stone pathway behind the family? Each person's shadow conforms to the expected geometry of the sunsave for the one in question. That supposed ghostly shadow is at the wrong angle and appears sharper than the others. It is not a natural projection, but a fabrication, or, rather, a deliberate addition during the development process." My brow furrowed. "But you said the photographer insisted the plate was untouched." Holmes gave a dry smile. "The photographer may be honest, or simply unaware. But this shadow was not cast. It was impressed either, scratched into the plate, or introduced during printing. Someone wanted that shadow to be seen. The question is not how it appeared, but why." Before I could respond, a knock came at the door. It was the butler, his expression unreadable. "Miss Clara Tilburn has invited you both to the morning room, sirs. She thought you might wish to meet Emily formally." Holmes nodded. Indeed. Please thank her. We followed the man through the winding corridors of Tilburn Grove to a cheerful room at the back of the house, where the windows looked out upon the sloping lawns, now hidden beneath mist. Clara Tilburn rose to greet ESA, tall woman in her early 40s, with high cheekbones, chestnut hair tied in a severe bun, and a complexion paled by strain rather than illness. My brother tells me you are assisting us. Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice steady, though her eyes revealed something brittle underneath. Thank you for coming. I confess, I've felt we are no longer safe in our own home. She turned to the little girl beside her. Emily, dearest, this is Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. Emily gave us a shy nod. Her gaze lingered on Holmes with something akin to recognition, though I could not say whether it was real or imagined. Holmes crouched slightly, coming level with her eyes. Miss Emily, he said gently, I saw you yesterday in the corridor. You pointed toward your uncle's study. May I ask, were you playing a game? She shook her head. He was telling me a secret. Holmes tilted his head. Your uncle. What sort of secret? Emily hesitated, then looked to her mother. Clara gave her an encouraging nod. He said someone was pretending, Emily whispered. Pretending not to know. Holmes didn't press her, but he turned to Clara. Has Emily always had such vivid conversations with imagined companions? Clara stiffened. Never. Only since the photograph. And you're certain no one else has encouraged this behavior? Her lips thinned. I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Holmes, but I know my daughter. And I know when something unnatural has taken root. I wake in the night to find her talking in her sleep to someone who isn't there. She says he stands in the corners and waits until no one else is looking. Holmes's gaze darkened slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he crossed the room to where a cabinet stood, its surface covered in framed family portraits. He studied them without comment before selecting one small silver frame and holding it up. This is Stephen Tilburn. Yes, Clara said, her voice softening. That was taken the summer before he died. He was a man in his early 30s, dark-haired and confident, with a knowing half-smile that suggested more than the camera captured. Something about his eyes unsettled me, though I could not have said why. Holmes returned the frame and asked, was there ever any doubt regarding the nature of Stephen's death? Clara blinked, caught off guard. No. He fell from a boat on the lake. He hit his head on the gunwale and drowned. It was ruled accidental. But was he alone? No, she said. There was someone else, his friend, Charles Denbury. They had gone out to fish, but Denbury said Stephen stood suddenly, lost his balance, and fell. By the time he dove in, it was too late. And Charles Denbury, Holmes asked, where is he now? I believe he moved abroad not long after. South America, I think. I haven't heard from him in years. Curious, Holmes murmured. Before more could be said, the door creaked slightly and a voice called from the hall. Mr. Holmes. It was the gardener, an older man with weather-cracked skin and keen, wary eyes. Pardon me, sir, but I thought you ought to know the side gate's been opened again. The lock was forced. Same as last week? Holmes asked. Alert now. The man said. Didn't think much of it at the time. Could have been children. But I mended the gate myself. Saw to it personally. And now it's been wrenched open again. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Show me. We followed the gardener through the garden, boots crunching over the frost-bitten grass. At the far edge of the property, beyond a low stone wall and tangled hedge, stood a rusted iron gate leading into the wooded perimeter of the Tilburn estate. The latch was twisted, the bolt half hanging as if someone had pried it free with force but care. Holmes knelt, examining the base. He picked up a scrap of cloth snagged on the lower corner, a piece of dark wool, slightly damp. He held it up, expression unreadable. "Someone has been coming and going," he murmured. "And not for the first time. Watson, make note, forced entry. No footprints yet visible, but the earth is soft enough. Perhaps we shall find more." He rose, staring through the iron bars into the trees beyond. "The deception deepens," he said. "This is no ghost story. This is a game played in shadows." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Later that afternoon, at Holmes's request, Edgar Tilburn summoned the remaining members of the household to the drawing-room under the pretense of a casual meeting. Holmes, of course, had other intentions entirely. He desired not just introductions, but an opportunity to observe them as a collective, how they entered, how they glanced at one another, and, most telling of all, how they reacted when the photograph was mentioned. The room itself was draped in the same quiet tension that clung to the rest of Tilburn Grove. A pair of wall sconces flickered with early lamplight, casting elongated shadows on the high walls as the fog pressed thickly against the glass. The first to arrive was Mr. Basil Rountree, Clara's cousin on their mother's side, a man in his mid-50s with a stout figure and eyes that shifted too readily for Holmes's taste. He gave off the air of one who had learned to make himself useful through a mixture of charm and careful silence. "Chilly business, this whole affair," he said, with a strained laugh. Not quite the birthday memory the little one was expecting. Holmes offered only a neutral nod. Next came Miss Evelyn Sharp, a governess recently appointed to Emily's education. She entered with an air of detachment, her spine straight and her gray eyes unreadable behind round spectacles. There was something deliberate in her if she were constantly taking the measure of the room. Then arrived Mr. Rupert Denbury, the younger brother of the elusive Charles Denbury, who had witnessed Stephen's drowning. Rupert bore some resemblance to his brother: high forehead, narrow nose, and a certain sharpness in the eyes. He was younger than I expected, perhaps no more than 30, dressed in a tailored waistcoat that suggested a man of urban habit, now trying to play the country gentleman. "Awful business," he muttered, taking a seat near the hearth. "My brother used to speak fondly of Stephen, you know. Dreadful what happened. Clara tells me you're poking into it again, Mr. Holmes. Hoping for what, exactly?" "Ghosts and curses." Holmes smiled faintly. "Only the truth, Mr. Denbury, and truth rarely hides behind ghosts, only behind people." Rupert shrugged. But I noticed the way he avoided Clara's eyes as she entered a moment later, guiding little Emily by the hand. Clara wore a carefully composed expression. Emily looked pale but calm, her eyes flickering curiously to Holmes, before she retreated to the window seat with a quiet doll in her lap. As the household settled into various chairs, Holmes stepped to the center of the room. He held the photograph in both hands. "I'm told that this image has been the subject of much concern," he began in a measured tone. "You have all likely seen the unusual shadow beside young Emily, the one that should not exist. At this, several pairs of eyes turned toward the photograph, while others, Rupert's, Evelyn's, lingered on Holmes instead, watching his face rather than the item in question. The photographer has assured me the plate was clean, Holmes continued, and yet the shadow appears to have been impressed unnaturally, a deliberate addition. Gasps broke the surface of the group, like sudden birds rising. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Basil frowned deeply. You mean someone tampered with the image? Basil asked. But why? That, Holmes said softly, is precisely the question. He paced slowly, the photograph lowered now. Miss Sharp, when did you first see the image? Evelyn Sharp blinked once, as though snapping out of reverie. 3 days after the party, I believe. Clara had shown it to me privately. I admit it unsettled me. And what did you see? A child, a shadow, nothing else that I could name. Holmes turned to Rupert Denbury. And you? I saw it when Clara sent word, he replied with a clipped tone. I traveled down as soon as I could. I'll not pretend it didn't rattle me, but I think it's all a bit much. Overactive nerves, perhaps. Holmes tilted his head. Have you seen your brother recently? Rupert's jaw tensed. No, not since he left for Brazil 2 years ago. We don't speak much, and yet your brother was the last person to see Stephen Tilburn alive. And now you're here, in his stead. I came to support the family, Rupert replied stiffly, and to see Emily. She always liked me. Holmes gave a vague smile, as though the statement had provided some secret confirmation. I understand that a housemaid, Miss Perkins, left suddenly after seeing the photograph. Did she speak to any of you before she departed? No one answered for a long moment. Then Basil cleared his throat. She came to me in the morning, said she felt watched, said she didn't trust the mirrors in the house. Odd thing to say, really. I thought she was unwell. Clara nodded slowly. She said little to me, only that something was wrong, but she wouldn't explain. Holmes absorbed this in silence. Then he stepped back and spoke with casual finality. I appreciate your candor. For now, I will ask that no one leave the estate without informing Mr. Tilburn, and I would advise you all to think carefully about the nature of secrets, particularly the ones you believe are buried. The room exhaled slowly. One by one, the guests made polite excuses and filtered away, their footsteps echoing against the old wooden floorboards. Holmes remained by the fireplace, watching the last of them vanish into the corridor. They lie too easily, he murmured. Did you see the way Sharp watched Clara? The way Rupert never looked at the child? I nodded. But you said nothing of the gate. Not yet, Holmes replied. That will come soon enough. There is something here, Watson layered, entangled. We are no longer merely investigating a shadow in a photograph. He turned toward the darkened hallway, where Emily's doll had been left sitting upright on the floor, eyes wide open and face turned toward the stairs. Holmes stooped, picked it up gently, and held it at eye level. She said her uncle told her someone was pretending, he said softly. Well, Watson, it seems this house is full of pretenders. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring. The following morning, I found Holmes in the library, standing before the hearth with his arms folded behind his back, eyes fixed not on the books or the fire, but on the portrait of Lord Harrogate that loomed above the mantel. The patriarch's eyes, painted with unnerving precision, stared sternly into the room, as though guarding the family's secrets from beyond the grave. Holmes turned as I entered. "Watson, there is an old French proverb," he said. "Celui qui crie la plus fort est souvent celui qui cache la plus." The one who shouts the loudest often hides the most. "Are you referring to someone in particular, Mr. Rupert Denbury?" I took a seat as Holmes paced, his insistence that the photograph is mere superstition combined with his sharp arrival following its discovery strikes me as oddly timed. He and Stephen were close once, and his brother, Charles, was present at Stephen's death. And yet Rupert claimed to know little of the affair. "You suspect him?" I asked. "I suspect he wants to be suspected," Holmes said, with a curious smile. "But whether out of guilt or performance remains to be seen." A knock came at the door. It was Edgar Tilburn, holding a sealed envelope. "This came for you by special courier, Mr. Holmes, marked urgent." Holmes took the envelope, broke the seal, and scanned the single page within. His expression changed subtly, tightening of the mouth, a flick of the eye. "It's from my contact at the Royal Academy of Photography," he said to me. "He's analyzed the plate used for the photograph. There are scratches, shallow but deliberate. The shadow beside Emily was indeed introduced post-capture, so someone manipulated the image, precisely, but not to frighten the child. That was collateral. The message was intended for someone else. And judging by reactions yesterday, Rupert Denbury took the bait. Moments later, as if summoned by name, Rupert himself appeared at the library door. "I say," he began, entering without invitation. "Do you mind if I speak with you, Holmes, in confidence?" "By all means," Holmes said, gesturing to a chair. Rupert sat, smoothing his waistcoat. He looked less polished than the day before. There were slight bags beneath his eyes, and a tremor at the corner of his mouth. "I came to ask," he began, "whether you believe there's any merit to all this. The photograph, the gate, the child's talk. What do you believe?" Holmes asked, watching him closely. Rupert hesitated. "I think someone's playing a game. A cruel one. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in people with motives." "And what motive might they have?" Holmes asked, voice smooth, "to unsettle the family. Perhaps to drive Clara into a state where she relinquishes control of the estate. Or to make someone perhaps look guilty." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Interesting that you offer your own name." Rupert's eyes flashed. "Because I know how it looks. Charles was there when Stephen died. People whispered that it was suspicious. Two men, one returns, the other doesn't." Holmes said nothing. "I know my brother," Rupert said, softer now. "He's arrogant, yes, and secretive, but not a killer." "And what if the death was not murder?" Holmes asked. "What if it was a cover for something else? A disappearance, perhaps?" Rupert stared at him, stunned. "You think Stephen might still be alive?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I think the truth is stranger than the illusion. That will be all for now, Mr. Denbury, but remain on the estate. I believe we are approaching a turn in the path." After Rupert had gone, I said, "You don't truly suspect him, do you?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he is guilty only of knowing too little and pretending otherwise. But he believes someone wants him blamed, and so he flails. A red herring, Watson, dressed in a waistcoat." That afternoon, Holmes and I ventured out to the gate once more. The wind had calmed, and in the soft soil beneath the hedgerow, Holmes found the trace of a boot heel narrow, elegant, and curiously indented at the arch. Not a man's shoe, he said, crouching low. This was made by a woman's boot, size 5 at most, recently placed. Looks still moist from the morning dew. I felt a chill, despite the calm air. A woman entered the estate this way. Holmes nodded. Or left. And I suspect I know who. We returned to the house, where Holmes requested to see Miss Evelyn Sharp once more. She met us in the drawing room. As ever. Miss Sharp, Holmes said, may I trouble you for a brief walk? There is something outside I'd like your opinion on. She looked faintly amused, but agreed, donning her cloak and gloves. Holmes led us to the side gate. When we arrived, he gestured to the ground. I've found traces of a woman's shoe, here size 5. Very narrow arch. You have slender feet, Miss Sharp. Might I ask if you walked this way recently? Her face changed, but only slightly. She knelt to look at the print. I might have, she said coolly. I walk in the woods sometimes to clear my thoughts. Even after the gate was reported forced open, Holmes asked. I thought it might have been servants. I didn't consider it dangerous. Holmes stepped closer. And yet you left no word, no note, no mention to the family that you had been outside the grounds. I wasn't aware I needed permission to take a walk. Holmes smiled thinly. You don't, but you do need to explain why your boots were found in the laundry room yesterday dry and scrubbed clean, though there had been no mud elsewhere on the grounds. She said nothing. I think, Holmes continued, you know more than you've let on, and I think you're frightened not of spirits, but of what someone in this house is capable of doing if they knew what you've seen. Her voice, when it returned, was quiet. I only wanted to help the girl. And what did you see? Holmes asked. Miss Sharp looked away. I saw Clara 2 nights ago, standing in Stephen's old study, talking to herself, crying, then laughing. It wasn't right. I left before she saw me. Holmes's expression did not change. Thank you, Miss Sharp. That will be all for now. As she walked back toward the house, her figure shrinking against the gray stone, I turned to Holmes. You believe her? I believe she is telling a version of the truth, Holmes said, but not the whole of it. He looked once more at the gate. The red herring is behind us now, Watson. But the waters grow no clearer, only deeper. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. Was well past midnight when Holmes knocked gently on the door to my room, already dressed in his greatcoat and gloves. The hallway outside lay silent under the weight of sleeping walls, and the lamps had been extinguished to shadows. Come, Watson, he said in a whisper, his voice low but energized. There is something I must show you before dawn breaks. Bring your candle. I followed him down the corridor, past the study that had belonged to Stephen Tilburn, until we arrived at a door I had not yet seen opened during our stay. Holmes produced a keystone and coppery, unlike the ornate brass used elsewhere in the house, and slid it silently into the lock. The attic, he said, as he pushed the door inward. Dust greeted us in great sweeping coils, stirred by the cold breath of night air that seeped through the eaves. We climbed a narrow wooden staircase into a long chamber, low-ceilinged and filled with the scents of mildew and mothballs. The only light came from our candles, which quivered in the still air like nervous watchers. This, Holmes murmured, is the most forgotten room in the house. and that makes it the most telling. He moved to an old trunk in the far corner, its lid half covered by a moth-eaten blanket. With a swift tug, he cast it off and lifted the latch. Inside lay a disorganized heap of belongings, papers, crumpled envelopes, a broken pair of spectacles, and several faded notebooks with black leather covers. These belonged to Stephen, Holmes said. They were brought up here after his death, quietly it seems, likely by Clara. He handed me one of the notebooks. The ink had faded, but the script remained legible. February 14th, told Clara again. She doesn't believe me, but I saw him leave the solicitor's office with that envelope. Mallory knows more than he's telling. I think Edgar suspects something. He's grown quiet when I enter the room. March 1st, Mallory is dead. Sudden illness. Too sudden. I think it's begun. March 2nd, Charles is asking too many questions. I may need to stage something. Something final. Holmes's voice broke the silence. Mallory, you recall the obituary I found in Stephen's study? I nodded slowly. Gerald P. Mallory, the solicitor, died just before Stephen. Precisely. I believe Stephen was keeping tabs on him, and I believe that what he learned became too dangerous to live with. I frowned. But what was he afraid of? Holmes opened another notebook and leafed through the pages until he came to a carefully drawn map, more than a sketch. It showed the grounds of Tilburn Grove, but beneath it, traced in fine red ink, was an addition, a tunnel, marked with the word archive and a date 1884, a hidden room. I murmured. Yes, Holmes said. One Edgar has not mentioned. I asked him outright yesterday whether there were any unused cellars or locked rooms beneath the house. He claimed there were none. Could he be lying? Holmes's expression hardened. I am certain of it, and that, Watson, is the inconsistency I've been waiting for. Edgar appears cooperative, generous, even, but in that lie he revealed a truth. There is something under this house he does not wish us to find. We descended the stairs and returned silently to our rooms. Holmes retired to his own chamber with a cryptic remark. At dawn, we dig. When morning came, Holmes wasted no time. After a brief and awkward breakfast, during which Rupert Denbury complained of headaches, and Clara barely spoke, Holmes excused himself with a peculiar request. I'd like to examine the cellar more closely, he said. I understand Tilburn Grove is built on older foundations. Edgar hesitated. Yes, parts of it date back to the early Georgian period. The wine cellar remains intact, but there's nothing of interest below shelves. A few broken barrels. May I see it nonetheless? Tilburn gave a strained smile. If you must. He led us down a narrow stone stairwell that curved into the earth, the air growing damper with each step. The cellar was long and low-ceilinged, with walls of ancient mortar sweating faintly in the dim light of our lanterns. At the far end stood a collapsed shelf and a mound of earth, half covering a wall of loose stones. Holmes immediately made for this spot. This wall isn't original, he said. It was built hastily. Look at the variation in the stone size, the absence of mortar in some crevices. He pressed his hand along the right edge. A hollow sound answered back. There's a space beyond. Tilburn looked uneasy. Perhaps an old coal shaft. They were common in houses of this age. Holmes stepped back. Watson, hand me that crowbar from the shelf. In a few minutes, Holmes had loosened 3 stones. Dust exploded outward, and a cold breath of stale air issued from the opening. Beyond, the darkness opened like a throat. He lit a fresh lantern and stepped inside. The chamber was narrow and lined with decayed shelves, most empty. But at the back sat an old iron cabinet, its hinges rusted but intact. Holmes pried it open. Inside were bundles of papers bound in ribbon wills, land deeds, and correspondences. Most bore the name Gerald P. Mallory. Holmes flipped through one quickly, then another, his brows furrowed. "These are altered copies," he said. "Look here, 2 versions of the same will. One naming Stephen as the heir, another naming Clara, both dated the same week. Different signatures, different witnesses." He looked up. "Forgery, Watson. A quiet war of paper and ink. I believe Stephen uncovered it trialized. Mallory had assisted someone in rewriting the family's inheritance behind his back, and was he silenced for it?" I asked. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he staged his own disappearance, hoping to expose it another way. Either way, this archive was hidden for a reason, and Edgar lied about its existence." Footsteps echoed on the stone stairs behind us. Edgar Tilburn appeared, face pale. "I must ask you," he said softly, "what are you doing in here?" Holmes turned slowly, looking for what you tried very hard not to show me. A long silence followed. Then Edgar said, "You don't understand what Stephen was doing." Holmes's voice was low and even. "Then I suggest you explain it to me before someone else tries to do so in blood." Chapter 7. The Crime Grows. Stranger Edgar Tilburn stood in the half-light of the cellar doorway, his face thrown into sharp relief by the flickering lantern Holmes held aloft. Dust clung to the folds of his coat, and a tension gathered in the air like a thunderhead. For a long moment, no one spoke. "You found something dangerous," Edgar said quietly. "I've found something you concealed," Holmes replied, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. "A hidden chamber, forged documents, and a motive buried in paper rather than blood." Edgar stepped forward, slowly, as though weighed down by something heavier than guilt. "I didn't hide it to protect myself," he said. "I hid it to protect the house, the family." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Go on." Edgar moved toward the old iron cabinet and placed a hand on it as though to steady himself. "Stephen discovered that father's solicitor Mallory had drawn up multiple versions of the estate's will. Some favored Clara, others me, even one naming a distant cousin I've never met. It wasn't just fraud, it was leverage. Mallory used them to manipulate my father, and, I suspect, others, and your brother." Holmes asked. "What did Stephen intend to do with that knowledge?" "He wanted to expose it," Edgar said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "He believed the estate was under siege from within, that someone had paid Mallory to falsify the records. He confronted Clara. I know that much, but she denied any involvement. Do you believe her?" I asked. Edgar hesitated. "I did, then. But the shadow in that photograph, and her behavior since, I'm not certain of anything anymore." Holmes handed me the bundle of forged wills and stepped back into the cellar. "Did Stephen ever speak of what he planned to do next?" "No," Edgar said. "The night before the accident, he said only that he was going to set things right. The next day, he was gone." Holmes's voice dropped. "Gone but not seen to drown. Only Charles Denbury witnessed that event, a man who vanished to South America shortly thereafter. Are you suggesting Stephen might have faked his own death? Edgar asked, the notion clearly unsettling him. I suggest, Holmes said, that the story we've been told is incomplete and those with the most to lose may have been eager to see it buried. We ascended from the cellar, the daylight above striking our eyes with harsh brilliance after the shadows below. Holmes walked in silence through the hall and out into the garden, where the fog had thinned into a soft, golden haze. The wind stirred the hedges gently, like whispered voices. It was there, as we passed the garden gate, that a scream split the air. High, piercing, from inside the house. Holmes turned instantly, his stride becoming a sprint. I followed, heart thudding. The sound had come from the west wing. We burst into the upstairs corridor to find Clara standing just outside Emily's room, clutching the frame of the doorway, her face ashen. She's gone, she whispered. Emily, she's not here. The bedroom was empty, the bed undisturbed, the window slightly ajar. Holmes crossed to it at once and leaned out. There's a vine trellis here, still swaying. She's climbed down. Clara clutched at her chest, but she wouldn't go out on her own, not without her shoes. Not, she wasn't alone, Holmes said grimly. Someone lured her. We searched the house from top to bottom, but Emily had vanished. The staff was summoned, the grounds combed, no sign of her. And then, from the gardener, came a discovery. Sir, he said breathlessly, I found this on the bench beneath the old oak. She was sitting there not 20 minutes ago. He held out a scrap of folded paper. Holmes opened it. Inside was a child's handwriting, simple and curved. He says I must come now. He says the truth is under the floor. Don't be afraid, Mummy, he says. You'll all understand soon. Emily. Holmes handed the note to Clara, whose knees buckled. I caught her arm and helped her to the nearest chair. She's been writing notes, she whispered. She's never done that before. She was told to, Holmes said softly, by someone she trusted. But who? Holmes stood very still. Then he said, Watson, the study. We returned to Stephen's old study in haste. Holmes moved the desk aside with uncharacteristic force, revealing a worn patch of rug that had been sewn crudely into the surrounding carpet. He cut it away with his pocket knife beneath old floorboards, and under those a trap door. He pried it open. A stone stair spiraled downward into a subterranean space, a different one than the archive. Narrow, hidden. We descended, lantern in hand. It was not a room, but a passage, cramped, damp. At the end of it, a single iron door. Holmes knelt and examined the lock. It was old, but still functioning. The dust here was disturbed recently. He opened it with a long creak. Inside, a small chamber, barely the size of a cupboard. And there, curled in the corner, with her doll in her arms, sat Emily. She looked up at us with wide eyes, unafraid. Uncle Stephen told me to wait here, she said. He said someone would come. Clara sobbed as she pulled her daughter into her arms. Holmes remained still, staring at the empty wall opposite the child. There, etched into the stone in rough, hurried script, were the words, They tried to silence me, but the house remembers. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The discovery of the hidden passage and the retrieval of Emily marked a turning point, one Holmes described. Later that evening, as the moment the shadow stepped forward. The house, once merely cloaked in suspicion, now seemed actively involved in its own defense, as if every corridor and brick sought to confess a long-suppressed truth. Emily was unharmed, though dazed, and Clara remained at her bedside, trembling with gratitude and confusion. The girl had not wandered into the passage alone of that Holmes was certain. She had been led, gently and deliberately, by someone who had studied her mind and spirit well enough to command her trust. That night, Holmes took his pipe, but did not light it. Instead, he sat in the darkened drawing room, fingers tapping rhythmically against the arm of his chair. I recognized the rhythm. It was the same one he used when playing out possibilities in his mind, like notes on a violin string. "I intend to provoke them," he said at last. Double quotes. "Who, precisely?" I asked. Holmes's silhouette turned toward me. "The person alive and very present who orchestrated the photograph, forced open the gate, falsified inheritance records, and lured a child into darkness. It is one mind behind these acts, Watson, though they wear many faces. And what do you intend to do?" He leaned forward. "I shall feed them a lie." The next morning, Holmes had Mrs. Hudson in his instruction telegraph an anonymous message to the Surrey Daily Post under the classified section, "Private to M. Arthur Stone chamber beneath the study has been opened." The girl spoke. "Copies have been secured. Return if you wish your name kept from the report." Holmes then spread a rumor among the staff that Scotland Yard detectives were arriving that afternoon with a magistrate's order to arrest one of the household. He instructed the butler to accidentally leave this information within earshot of both Basil Rowntree and Rupert Denbury. The bait, he claimed, would work best when it was overheard. I watched these machinations with concern. "You're risking lives, Holmes." "I am," he said soberly. "But if we wait for the culprit to act again without constraint, someone else may disappear, and not into a cupboard this time." By mid-afternoon, tension gripped Tilburn Grove like a tightening noose. Clara had taken Emily to her own room. Basil paced the drawing room, sipping brandy with a shaking hand. Rupert Denbury went conspicuously missing for half an hour, returning with his hair damp and coat collar turned. But it was Evelyn Sharp who drew Holmes's attention. "She's too quiet," he said as we walked the upper hall. "A governess in a house this troubled should be more present, and yet she hovers just outside conversations, always listening. You suspect her." "I suspect she's waiting for something." Just then, a sharp crash echoed from the east wing. Holmes and I ran toward the sound, emerging into the long gallery where the family portraits hung in solemn ranks. At the far end, a glass case had been shattered. Inside, it had been an heirloom gold timepiece, said to belong to Lord Harrogate himself. It now lay in shards upon the floor, and beside it stood Evelyn Sharp, her face pale, her fingers bleeding slightly. I was reaching for a book," she stammered. "I must have lost my balance." Holmes said nothing. He stooped, picked up the ruined watch, and examined the inner casing. "Curious," he murmured. He held it up for me to see. There, etched crudely into the back of the timepiece, were the initials C.D. Charles Denbury. Later, in the privacy of the study, Holmes laid the broken watch on the desk and turned to me. "She was not reaching for a book," he said. "She was planting a clue or retrieving one. The initials are too perfect. Placed there, to shift suspicion. Back to Charles. Indeed. But Charles is in Brazil. Long gone, and yet his ghost walks the halls like Stephen's. He paused, fingers steepled. Watson, what if I told you that the same person who lured Emily into the passage also etched these initials? That the shadow in the photograph, the gate, the fake will, and the sudden interest in portrait galleries are all steps in a single choreography? I would say you're dangerously close to naming your suspect, I said. Holmes rose. Not yet. But I will soon if they take one final step. He moved to the hearth, where he had laid a second bundle of Mallory's papers. With great care, he inserted a fake document into the stack one we had written the night before, naming an unknown heir in Paris. It was a forgery, but so exquisitely done that only an exporter, the guilty party, would recognize it as bait. This, Holmes said, is our final trap. At midnight, Holmes and I waited in silence behind the bookcases of the study. The fire had been reduced to embers, casting just enough glow to silhouette the desk and the planted document atop it. The house slept. Then the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside slowly, cautiously. Not Evelyn, not Rupert, but Clara Tilburn. Holmes said nothing. Neither did I. She moved to the desk, her hand hovering over the papers like a pianist reaching for a familiar note. Then she picked up the forged will. She held it to the fire, and before she could toss it in, Holmes stepped out from the shadows. I would rather you didn't. Clara froze. The flames licked at the edges of the page, then died as she released it with trembling hands. Her voice, when it came, was ragged. You don't understand. I was trying to protect my daughter. You used her, Holmes said quietly. You used Stephen's image, his study, his secrets, because you were afraid his real story would return and take everything from you. She turned, eyes bright with fury. He was going to destroy us. He was going to ruin the family name, claim everything as his. He always hated Father's decisions. He never forgave us for siding with Edgar after the war. Stephen was many things, Holmes said, but he was not cruel to his niece, and he did not deserve to vanish beneath the floor. Clara's shoulders sagged. He knew about the wills, about Mallory, about me. I didn't kill him, Mr. Holmes, but I made sure no one listened when he tried to speak. Holmes glanced at me. Watson, he said, wake the others. I believe it's time the house heard the truth. Chapter 9, A Second Attempt. The culprit strikes again, despite Holmes's quiet command to wake the house. I hesitated. Clara Tilburn stood at the center of the study, surrounded by shadows, her eyes dim with fatigue and surrender. She did not move to flee, nor argue, nor weep. Her expression held something stranger than fear. It was relief, as if the weight of years had finally shifted, even if only by a fraction. I never meant for Emily to be harmed, she whispered. I only wanted to frighten someone. I thought the shadow in the photograph would be enough to unnerve Edgar. Maybe make him confess. Holmes listened, arms folded, his silhouette backlit by the guttering fire. You forged the shadow. No, she said, looking at him. That wasn't me. Holmes stiffened, and I took a step forward. Then who? I don't know, Clara replied, shaking her head. I planted the forged documents, yes? I lured Emily to the passage. I used stories Stephen had told her, repeated them, word for word. She thought it was a game. But the photograph. Someone else made that. I swear it. Holmes's face turned unreadable, but I saw something flicker there, an unwanted confirmation. Clara had acted out of desperation, perhaps even cruelty. But she had not forged that image. The shadow in the photograph remained unclaimed. It was then, just as I moved toward the door to rouse Edgar and the others, that a sudden bang reverberated through the house, sharp, metallic, and close. Holmes spun around. "Study door," he said instantly. "The corridor." We rushed out, Holmes ahead of me. The narrow hallways of Tilburn Grove now shuddering with the sound of frantic footsteps above. Someone was running boots on floorboards, swift and irregular. At the top of the stairwell, we found Basil Rowntree, his dressing gown half torn and his face streaked with sweat. He held onto the banister, breathing heavily. "Someone's in the archive," he panted. I heard the latch. The floor groaned beneath them. Holmes leaped past him without pause, his coat trailing behind him like a hunting hawk in descent. I followed, nearly stumbling on the steps, down into the cellar once more. This time we did not hesitate at the collapsed stone wall. The loose stones had been pried wider since our last visit. Someone had been down here after us. Holmes passed through, lantern raised. The archive chamber lay in disarray. The cabinet had been smashed open. Papers, those we had carefully reviewed, were scattered across the floor. And on the ground near the cabinet lay a small tool, a chisel taut fresh, with damp earth on its handle. Someone tried to destroy the contents, Holmes said grimly. They were looking for something. I knelt beside the cabinet and pulled a scorched envelope from beneath the others. The corner bore the black wax seal of Mallory's office, but the top had been ripped open. The document inside was gone. "They found it," I said. Holmes nodded. "Or believe they have. The question is, what was in it?" From the stairway came a shout. "Edgar!" He entered with a lantern and stared in horror at the scene. "Who did this?" "That's what we must determine," Holmes said. And quickly, an hour later, the household stood assembled once more in the drawing room. Clara sat silently near the window, Emily on her lap. Basil was pale, twitching at the collar. Rupert Denbury stood apart from the rest, staring into the fire. Holmes addressed them as though delivering a lecture at a university. "Last night, someone entered the archive beneath the cellar," he said. "They removed a specific document one Mallory had hidden. It was not simply a will. It was a ledger, a record of payments made over a 3-year span." He held up a soot-stained envelope. "The names recorded are of interest. One, in particular, has appeared in no other record. It was this name the intruder hoped to destroy because it identifies a co-conspirator who funded Mallory's work." He looked directly at Basil Rowntree. Basil's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Holmes continued. "Mr. Rowantree's investments were not doing well. The inheritance he expected after Lord Harrogate. Death was threatened when Mallory split the estate between Stephen and Clara, but with Mallory's help and the right amount of influence he ensured new documents were created, forged, hidden." Basil's face turned gray. "That's absurd. I didn't know what Mallory was doing. I never paid him." "No." Holmes held up another document. A signed banknote from your personal account, dated 2 months before Lord Harrogate's passing. "I was trying to help Clara," Basil cried suddenly. "She deserved more than Stephen. He was reckless. He gambled with the family name, and when he found out, He threatened to expose us both. Clara looked up, her expression stricken. You told me it was harmless. He was going to bring everything down, Basil said bitterly. The house, the name, the land, everything. I didn't touch him, I swear. But I knew. I knew the boat accident was too neat. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You were at the lake that day. No, Basil snapped. But Charles was. He told me later drunkenly that Stephen had confronted him, said he was going to London with proof, but Stephen never made it. And you never reported it, Holmes said coldly. I was protecting the family, Basil whispered. Holmes gave a long, slow nod. Your lies did more damage than the truth ever could. Silence fell once more, and then Evelyn Sharp entered the room, her boots muddy, her sleeves rolled. I found something, she said simply, out by the trellis, buried near the rose bushes. She held out a bundled damp cloth wrapped around what looked like a notebook. Holmes took it and opened the cover. It was Stephen Tilburn's journal, not the one found in the attic, but one written after. After he had supposedly drowned, Watson stepped forward. But that means, Holmes looked up. Yes, it means Stephen survived the lake. For a time, Chapter 10, the true motive begins to surface. Holmes stood in the center of the drawing room, Stephen Tilburn's newly unearthed journal in his hands. The weight of it, damp, frayed, and stained with age, seemed almost symbolic, as though the house itself had conspired to keep it hidden until the exact moment its silence could be broken. Everyone present felt the shift. Even Emily, curled half asleep in her mother's lap, stirred at the tension that charged the room like a coming storm. Holmes opened the journal with reverence, turning carefully through its sodden pages. The ink was smudged but legible, the script unmistakably Stephen's, neat and forceful, with the occasional frantic scratch where emotion had overruled control. He read aloud. April 4th, I made it to the old stable by midnight. The boat was found the next morning, just as I planned. Charles left the scene rattled, bless him. He'll believe I fell. He always lacked the imagination to doubt what he was told. But I cannot go home. Not yet. I must be sure. The ledger must be found. The archive was sealed long ago, but I think I can reach it through the passage behind the study. I only hope Clara has not changed the locks. Holmes looked up. Stephen faked his death to continue his investigation without obstruction. He knew someone in the house had corrupted the will and bribed Mallory, but he wasn't certain who. This journal proves that he stayed hidden for at least a short time afterward, perhaps days, perhaps longer. He turned to another entry, his voice taut. April 6th, I saw Emily in the window today. Just for a second. She's growing. It hurt to see her, knowing I can't speak, but I've left a clue in the photograph, stipped it with the tools in the old camera box. Not to frighten her, but to frighten the one who knows the truth, the one who watches too closely. If they see that shadow again, they'll remember I'm not as dead as they hoped. A low murmur passed through the room. Evelyn Sharp covered her mouth. Rupert Denbury stepped back and sat heavily on the edge of the armchair. Basil, notably, said nothing. I stared at Holmes. Then the shadow in the photograph wasn't planted by Clara or Basil, it was Stephen himself. Yes, Holmes said softly. A warning. Clara's voice was faint, but the image was taken weeks after Stephen's supposed death. How could he? Holmes closed the journal and placed it gently on the mantel. Stephen was still alive, possibly in hiding on the estate, possibly aided by someone. He turned toward Evelyn Sharp. Miss Sharp, when did you begin working here? She swallowed. 6 weeks ago. I replaced the previous governess, Mrs. Langdon. And who recommended you for the position? I responded to a notice in the paper, she said. Or I thought I did. Now I'm not so sure. The letter of offer came unsigned. Holmes stepped closer, eyes narrowing. And were you aware at any point that someone else was residing secretly in this house? No, she said. Though there were nights I thought I heard someone in the east wing. Once I even saw candlelight behind the mirror in the dressing room. I told myself it was my imagination. Holmes looked to me. Watson, do you recall the dust on the floorboards outside the hidden study entrance? Thin but recently disturbed. I nodded. Stephen was here, Holmes said to the room. Perhaps for weeks, perhaps longer, but something happened. Either he was discovered or forced out. The journal ends abruptly. We have no record of what became of him after April 6th. At that, Rupert Denbury spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. My brother, Charles, he never spoke of what happened that day at the lake. Not in detail. Only that it was quick, that Stephen lost his balance and struck his head. Or, Holmes said, that Charles saw something he was not meant to witness. Something he was paid not to understand. He turned to Basil. Mr. Rowntree, you knew Stephen had vanished. You were complicit in the falsification of the will. And you stood to gain more than anyone if Stephen remained dead. Basil trembled. You're twisting facts. I am binding them together, Holmes said sharply. And the thread points directly to you. Before Basil could answer, Edgar rose, his voice firm. If you know something more, Basil, say it now. Basil turned slowly, his lips tight. I suspected he was alive. That's true. I found footprints outside the West Wing window a week after the funeral. I told no one. What could I say? That the dead had returned. Why not confront him? I asked. I was afraid of what he'd say, Basil said. Afraid he'd expose everything. Clara looked away. Holmes approached the hearth, his gaze distant now. I believe Stephen returned to the estate again, long after the supposed drowning. He must have been hiding, possibly entering and exiting through the gate. He etched the shadow, left clues in the study. But his trail ends. Which means someone found him. A hush descended. Holmes continued. It's possible he fled again. It's also possible he died for real, this time hidden or buried where no one thought to look. But the motives remain here, tangled, alive. He turned slowly toward Clara, Basil, Rupert Tevan, Edgar, and whoever saw him last has yet to speak. At that moment, a knock echoed from the front door. The butler opened it and in stepped a man with a cane, a heavy beard, and a wide-brimmed hat. He removed it with slow precision. I believe you've all been wondering where I've been, he said. Voice hoarse but unmistakable. Emily looked up from her seat, and Holmes, ever calm, merely said, Stephen Tilburn, I presume. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. For a moment, silence held Tilburn Grove in its grasp like a closing fist. No one moved. Even the fire seemed to still itself, its crackling muted beneath the thunderous quiet that followed Stephen Tilburn's arrival. He stood in the foyer, gaunt and ghost-like, but unmistakably alive. His eyes scanned the room with the slow, weighted gaze of a man who had returned from far too much. The beard disguised the familiar angles of his face, but the voice, the gravel and resonance of it cut, he said, setting the cane aside. But that would be a lie. Clara rose first. Her mouth opened, closed again, then settled into something between disbelief and dread. "Stephen," she whispered. "Alive and mostly intact," he replied dryly. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation. "Mr. Tilburn, I would ask that you sit. There is much that requires clarification, and you, it seems, hold more answers than any among us." Stephen's mouth curved into something faintly resembling a smile. "I daresay I do." He moved to the armchair Holmes indicated and lowered himself into it carefully. Beneath the thick coat, his frame was thinner, his hands calloused and nicked. Time had not spared him. "I saw the notice," he said, looking up at Holmes. "In the Surrey Post. That was your doing." Holmes inclined his head. "A lure. I assumed, based on what I had gathered, that you had not died, that you were hiding, perhaps close, and that if you knew the truth was about to be exposed or distorted you'd return." "You assumed correctly," Stephen said. Clara took a hesitant step forward. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why hide all this time? Why disappear?" "Because I had no choice," Stephen answered, his voice hardening. "Because Mallory was murdered. Because someone tried to kill me. And because I needed proof before I returned." Gasps rose among the assembled, but Holmes raised a hand. "Go on," he said. "Start at the beginning." "The day of your death." Stephen nodded, eyes distant. "Charles and I went out in the boat, as planned. But I wasn't there to fish. I confronted him. I told him I had proof that someone had paid Mallory to alter the estate documents, that there were copies hidden in the archive beneath the house. I had already found the tunnel behind the study. I was going to bring it all forward." He paused, flexing one hand slowly. Charles grew frightened. He begged me to let it go. Said there were people involved who wouldn't forgive exposure. He warned me. "Then he stood upend the boat?" Holmes asked. "No," Stephen said. "I jumped." That startled even me. "I saw the opportunity," Stephen explained. "I let the water take me for a moment, then swam to the south bank. I had left my clothes and documents there the night before, in a satchel. I watched Charles scream for help, and I knew I was free to disappear." Rupert's voice broke the hush. "You didn't tell anyone, not even me." Stephen looked at his cousin with weary eyes. "I couldn't. I didn't know who was involved. I only trusted Emily, and she was too young to understand." He glanced at the child, whose small fingers gripped her doll tightly. Holmes asked, "And then?" "I lived rough in the woods for a week, then made contact with a friend in town, an old painter named Stroud. He let me hide in his cottage outside Guildford. I spent the next year tracking Mallory's financials, his connections. I found Basil's name, Clara's, too. I found out Mallory had received payments from an account managed under Basil's alias, Rowe and Company. I knew I needed more." Stephen leaned forward now. "But then Mallory died. I returned here in secret to search the archives. I etched the photograph shadow myself, used Stroud's tools. A message. I had hoped Basil would recognize it. Instead, I found the archive had been resealed. And so you went underground again," Holmes said. Stephen nodded. Until I saw the article, I knew the time had come. I feared too much had already unraveled. At this, Holmes finally stood and turned to the others. You now know the truth of Stephen Tilburn's vanishing, but not yet the truth of what followed. He stepped behind the desk and opened the journal Evelyn Sharp had found. Stephen survived. But someone here did not want that. That person attempted to destroy the ledger in the archive. They forced open the gate. They planted a clue to blame Charles Denbury. They were prepared to use a child as bait. His eyes landed on Basil. But before Holmes could speak further, Basil lurched to his feet. This has gone far enough, he shouted. You can't trust the word of a man who's been skulking about like a rat for 2 years. Who knows what he did to Mallory? You know what he did? Holmes said coolly. Nothing. Mallory died by poisons administered, according to the coroner. But he left behind a letter, a confession, and in that letter he names you. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded page. I received it from my colleague at Scotland Yard this morning. A duplicate kept by Mallory's clerk. He feared for his life, and rightly so. The original never reached the authorities, but this one did. Basil turned pale. Holmes stepped forward. You paid Mallory to alter the will. When Stephen discovered it, you helped arrange his disappearance, hoping it would be permanent. When he returned in secret, you tried again, but the house resisted. The clues he left, the trail he carved, refused to stay buried. Basil's voice shrank to a whisper. I only did what I thought was right. No, Holmes said. You did what you thought you could get away with. Holmes turned to the butler. Summon Inspector Brighton from the village. Tell him he is needed immediately. As the servant hurried off, Basil slumped into his chair, and Stephen looked to Holmes. What now? He asked. Holmes gave a rare, tired smile. Now, Mr. Tilburn, the shadow in the photograph is no longer a warning, it's a testimony. One we shall place before the law. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Arrival of Inspector Brighton from the local constabulary was swift and uneventful. A quiet constable of keen eyes and few words, who took in the assembled company at Tilburn Grove with a practiced detachment. Holmes, never one to waste time on ceremony, placed Mallory's duplicate confession in the inspector's hands. With a brief summary of events, Brighton read in silence, then turned toward Basil Rowntree with something more akin to sadness than outrage. You'll come with me, sir, he said simply. We'll take your statement down at the Guildford station. Basil offered no protest. His face had drained of its usual ruddy arrogance. What remained was a man hollowed out by exposure. He followed Brighton without a word, his steps quiet as he passed Stephen Tilburn, his cousin, his near victim, without daring to look him in the eye. As the front door shut behind them, the room exhaled. Clara stood by the window, staring out into the fog-laced garden. Emily, nestled in her arms, dozed gently now, exhausted by the whirlwind of revelations. Rupert Denbury sat in the corner, silent, fiddling with a cufflink, perhaps wondering how narrowly he'd skirted suspicion. Evelyn Sharp had returned to her quarters, and Edgar, though composed, showed the kind of quiet devastation that comes when a house's history cracks. Like plaster under rain, Holmes remained by the hearth, eyes fixed on the smoldering embers, his posture unmoved. but I recognized the tension in his shoulders. The case was near its end, but not complete. Not quite. He turned, suddenly, speaking without looking up. "Stephen," he said, "may I ask you to read the final pages of your recovered journal aloud?" Stephen, seated near the side table, frowned. "I've already explained most of what's in it." "Yes," Holmes said, "but indulge me." Stephen opened the sodden book and flipped through its swollen leaves, stopping as he neared the final entry. The ink there was darker, more recent. It had been written after everything else. He cleared his throat and read, "April 7. I saw her today, Clara. She was in the garden near the south wall." She looked at me, and I know she saw me, but she said nothing. I think she understood, perhaps even pitied me. I wanted to approach, but I couldn't, not yet. He turned the page. "April 9th, I found the final piece." Mallory's ledger was not hidden in the archive. It was sealed beneath the stone box in the study. I retrieved it tonight. Tomorrow I shall return it to the clerk in London. Once he has it, the rest will fall. Stephen paused. "I never made that delivery," he said, looking at Holmes. "The day after I wrote this, someone ambushed me on the south path. I was struck behind the ear. When I awoke, the ledger was gone." Holmes nodded slowly. "That is when I believe you ceased being a ghost and became a target." He turned now to Clara, whose reflection shimmered in the glass. "You knew he was alive." She did not respond. "You saw him," Holmes continued. "You recognized your brother. You suspected what he was doing, but you did not betray him." Still no answer. Holmes stepped forward. "Because you had already betrayed him once. Sand couldn't do it again." At that, Clara turned. Her eyes were red, but dry. "I thought he would destroy the family," she said quietly. "I thought he would ruin us all out of pride. I believed Basil when he said Stephen wanted everything for himself. But when I saw him that day, when he stared at me through the hedge, I saw the truth." "What truth?" Edgar asked, stepping closer. "That I was wrong," she said. "Stephen wasn't vengeful. He was wounded, determined. He looked more like father than I ever realized." Holmes gave her a long look. "And yet you said nothing." "What would I say?" Clara asked. "That the dead man walks again. That our sins had not been buried with him." No one answered. Stephen closed the journal. "I never blamed you," he said. "Not really. We all did what we thought was right in the moment. You protected Emily. I tried to protect the truth." Holmes spoke then, his voice distant. "The truth never stays buried, not forever. Houses like Tilburn Grove have long memories. They whisper things into the ears of children and draw shadows onto photographs. You were fortunate that the house spoke before someone else silenced it forever." Outside, a crow cried once. A wind stirred the hedge. Clara took Emily in her arms and nodded once. "I will tell her," she said, "when she's older. About Stephen. About what happened. She deserves to know." Stephen stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his niece's head. "She already knows," he said. "She never forgot me." Emily, eyes closed, murmured, "Uncle Stephen," and smiled. Later that evening, Holmes and I prepared to depart. Our things were packed, the carriage summoned. Stephen stood with Edgar by the gate, watching us. "You'll remain at Tilburn Grove?" I asked. "For a time," Stephen said. "There are things to settle, and rooms that need unlocking." "Don't wait too long to return to the world," Holmes advised. It has a way of forgetting even the loudest ghosts. Stephen nodded, but it remembers shadows. As we stepped into the carriage, Holmes leaned back against the seat, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I watched him for a long time before I spoke. You never told anyone how you knew Stephen was still alive. What made you so certain? Holmes's eyes opened slowly. Because, Watson, shadows cast by the dead do not grow sharper with time. They fade. But this one, this shadow in the photograph, was fresh, intentional. It had something to say. He paused, his voice softening. And I have learned, over many cases, that when a shadow speaks, it is best to listen. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape the next morning broke with a grim clarity. Rain had passed in the night, and the skies above Tilburn Grove bore the gray hush that often follows a storm when the world seems suspended, waiting. Holmes and I were preparing to leave at last when a knock interrupted our breakfast in the guest parlor. It was Evelyn Sharp, pale and visibly unsettled. "There's something you must see," she said, at once. We followed her to the west corridor, where the servants' stairs began, winding down to the root of the estate. She led us not to the cellar, nor to the study, but to the rear carriage house's structure, long unused, its doors warped with damp and locked with rust. "I saw light through the slats just before dawn," Evelyn said, "a flickering, like a lantern. When I returned, the door was still warm." Holmes stepped forward, knelt, and placed his fingers to the heavy iron latch. "Recently opened," he murmured. "The rust has been disturbed. Watson, help me with this." Together we forced the door open, with a reluctant groan of iron and wood inside. The air was dense with dust, but among the forgotten tools and broken barrels, a trail of boot prints marked the soil floor crisp and fresh. Holmes raised his lantern. At the far wall, a set of trunks stood open. Inside one was a coat Rupert, Denbury's unmistakable, and tucked within its pocket, Holmes retrieved a folded piece of parchment. It was a ferry schedule, dated for that afternoon. Destination, Portsmouth. Holmes read it silently, then spoke, his tone measured. "He intends to flee, Rupert," I said, stunned. "But he hasn't even been questioned." Holmes nodded slowly. "Which is why he believes now is the only time he can still slip away." He handed me the schedule. "He's cleverer than he appears. The game of innocence, the vague sympathies, the idle silence, it was all a ruse. He feared being questioned, Watson, because he knows the one man who can truly implicate him has returned." "You mean Stephen?" "No," Holmes said grimly. "I mean Charles Denbury." I blinked. "But Charles is in Brazil, is he?" Holmes asked. "Or was that a convenient fiction?" He turned back toward Evelyn. "Miss Sharp, have you seen Rupert this morning?" "No," she said. "Not since last night." Holmes nodded. "Then we've little time." We rode hard for the station, the carriage wheels clattering across rain-slick cobbles. Holmes stared out the window, hands gloved and unmoving, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Rupert knew Stephen was alive," he said, almost to himself. "I believe he even knew where Stephen was hiding. But his plan was not to silence Hammett, was to frame him." "Frame him," I echoed. "Indeed," Holmes said. "The shadow in the photograph frightened Rupert, because it meant Stephen had returned. But when Clara's deception was uncovered, Rupert saw an opportunity. The forged initials on the watch, the tampered ledger, The suggestion that Charles's brother had killed Stephen, and now Stephen had returned to kill again. He turned toward me. You see, Watson, Rupert's genius was in not being present, to let the others betray themselves while he moved quietly in the background. At the station, the platform was crowded with passengers and the hissing of steam. Holmes leaped from the carriage and scanned the crowd. There, he said, pointing. Rupert stood at the far end, a small suitcase in hand, hat pulled low, collar turned high. He was speaking to a porter, preparing to board the early train south. We moved swiftly, Mr. Denbury, Holmes called out. Rupert froze, then turned with exaggerated surprise. Mr. Holmes, I hadn't expected to see you here. No, Holmes replied evenly. I imagine you hoped you wouldn't. Rupert spread his hands. I've business in Portsmouth. I told Edgar of it. No, Holmes said again. You told Edgar you might visit a friend in Portsmouth next month. Yet you're here now, with a ferry schedule tucked in your coat and your name on a stateroom booking aboard the Eliza May, bound for Calais tomorrow morning. Rupert's jaw clenched. You've been following me. Holmes stepped closer. I've been following the truth, Mr. Denbury, and you, it seems, have been trying to outrun it. Rupert's voice shifted slightly lower, slightly sharper. You've no proof of anything. On the contrary, Holmes said. I have a letter sent from your brother Charles postmarked from Dover, not Brazil. He was seen disembarking only 2 weeks ago. You told the family he had vanished abroad. You told the authorities you hadn't spoken in years. He withdrew a second envelope from his coat. This letter was intercepted. Charles was trying to reach Stephen. It spoke of guilt, of pressure, of being paid to vanish. And the signature CD matches the carving on the watch you planted. You tried to use him one last time, didn't you? Just as you used Clara and Basil, but he changed his mind. Rupert's face twisted. He broke the arrangement. Holmes raised a hand. There it is. The briefest flash of panic crossed Rupert's features. You feared Stephen would return. You feared Charles would confess. And when Stephen did return, alive and speaking, you knew your only option was flight. Rupert took a step backward, but to constables summoned discreetly by Holmes earlier that morning. We're already closing in. He looked left, right, then dropped the suitcase and bolted. Holmes did not move. One of the constables caught Rupert just before the stairwell to the freight yard. He was pulled to a stop, breathing heavily, deflated. Holmes approached slowly. There is a saying, he said quietly, that the dead cannot speak, but shadows do, and yours has followed you far too long. Rupert Denbury said nothing as he was led away. His shoulders bowed against the morning wind. On the return journey to Tilburn Grove, Holmes was quiet again, but as we passed through the gates and saw Stephen walking the garden paths with his niece, Holmes offered a rare smile. This case, he said, was not about a single crime. It was about the war between silence and confession, between what we bury on, what insists on being remembered. And you chose to listen to a shadow, I said. Holmes looked at me. No, Watson, I chose to believe it. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed the days that followed. Rupert Denbury's attempted flight were a strange blend of stillness and revelation. Tilburn Grove, long oppressed by the weight of silence, began to exhale. The corridors no longer echoed with whispers, and even the lingering fog seemed to lift. Yet beneath this surface calm, Holmes moved with renewed urgency. For though Rupert's arrest had tied off one thread, Holmes was not yet satisfied. "Something still gnaws at the edge of this," he said to me 2 mornings later, as we sat by the drawing-room fire. "A question of authorship, of the forged wills?" I asked. "No, Watson," he replied, "of the deception itself. Rupert was a coward, a manipulator, but not an artist. Someone else orchestrated the rhythm of this entire scheme. Someone with access, patience, and the confidence to watch others play the game for them." I leaned forward, but Basil confessed. Clara admitted her role. Rupert fled. Holmes turned toward the window, eyes narrowed. "Yes, and yet there is one piece left, unsolved, the ledger. The original, not the copy, not the burnt remnants. The true document Mallory feared would surface. You believe it still exists?" "I am certain of it," Holmes said. "And I believe the one person left unexamined has known all along where it was." He stood, and without further explanation, strode from the room. I followed. Naturally, we found Edgar Tilburn in the estate's upper study, seated at a writing desk beneath the portrait of Lord Harrogate. He looked older than he had a week prior, drawn thinner, and weighed down by the house's long shadows. Holmes closed the door behind us with a soft click. "Mr. Tilburn," he said, "may I trouble you for a confession?" Edgar looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon. A simple admission will suffice," Holmes said. "You've been hiding the ledger since the beginning. You found it in the study the day Stephen vanished. You read it. You saw your own name in it." Edgar rose slowly, face pale. "You're mistaken." "I am not," Holmes said. "It was you who sealed the archive. You who created the illusion that Stephen had died without ever recovering the proof. And you who let Rupert and Basil fall deeper into their own schemes while you watched from above." Edgar's composure cracked for just a breath. Then, recovering, he said, "Why would I hide it? I stood to lose nothing." Holmes stepped closer. "On the contrary, you stood to lose everything. Your name appears on one of the earliest entries in Mallory's ledger. A single payment, small, but enough to implicate you as the first to benefit from the altered will. Perhaps you thought it was harmless at the time, a technicality. But when Stephen discovered the archive, you realized, too late, that your name was among those who owed their status to a lie." "I never conspired to harm Stephen," Edgar said tightly. "No," Holmes agreed. "But you feared his return. And when the photograph surfaced, when Emily spoke his name, you realized he had never left. And so you waited, hoping someone else would bury the truth again." Edgar looked away. Holmes continued, gentler now. "Even your silence was an act of protection. You believed you were shielding Clara, the family, the grove. But silence, Mr. Tilburn, is often a betrayal dressed in noble clothing." Edgar slowly moved to the fireplace and, with trembling fingers, reached behind a loose stone in the mantel. From within, he pulled a small, weathered book bound in cracked green leather, its edges scorched and its ribbon faded. Holmes received it with reverence. "The original ledger," he confirmed. "Untouched." Edgar sat heavily. "I found it the day after Stephen vanished. I recognized my name, yes, but I didn't understand the full scope. I panicked. I sealed the archive myself and hid the ledger. When Basil grew nervous and Clara grew erratic, I convinced myself I had done the right thing, that the less anyone knew, the better. And Rupert? I asked. Edgar exhaled. He came to me months ago, said he had received a letter from Charles, that there were whispers in London that Stephen still lived. He asked for money. I refused. Yet he stayed, Holmes said, and watched. Edgar nodded, defeated. I feared he'd discover the ledger. He nearly did. Holmes tucked the ledger into his coat. This will go to Scotland Yard, he said. With your testimony, they may choose leniency. I expect no mercy, Edgar murmured. Only peace. That afternoon, Holmes requested a final audience with Stephen. We left Tilburn Grove the following morning. The mist returned as we rode out, curling through the hedgerows like old regrets. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, though his eyes were not distant. They were focused, as if already turning toward the next enigma on some unseen horizon. I ventured a final question as the house faded behind us. Double quotes. Holmes, why did you truly take the case? You never said. He paused before answering. Because of the photograph, he said simply. It wasn't the shadow, Watson. It was the girl, Emily, the way she looked at it. He turned to me then. She didn't see something frightening. She saw someone familiar. Children, you see, have no patience for lies. And when they see a shadow, they do not ask, what is it hiding? They ask, who is it? He leaned back, closed his eyes, and added, almost as an afterthought, and that, Watson, is where all good deductions begin. We found him in the East Garden with Emily, who was threading violets into the slats of a wooden bench. The two looked more at ease than we had seen them, almost ordinary, as though a great clock had finally wound down. Holmes greeted them both, then handed Stephen the recovered ledger. Stephen's eyes darkened as he leafed through it. So it was Edgar. Only at the beginning, Holmes said. The rest conspired without his consent, but he bore their secrets too long. As did you. Stephen closed the book. Then we're done, almost, Holmes said. There remains one last question. Stephen looked up. Why did you leave the message in the photograph for Clara? Holmes asked. Why not Edgar? Or Basil? Stephen smiled faintly. Because Clara was the only one I still loved enough to warn. Even in betrayal, she protected Emily. I needed her to know I was alive and watching. Holmes nodded once, satisfied. As we turned to leave, Emily rose and tugged at Holmes's sleeve. Mr. Holmes, she said, will the house be quiet now? Holmes crouched slightly to meet her eyes. No, Miss Emily. It will remember, but it will no longer whisper in fear. She nodded solemnly, then skipped away. Holmes straightened and turned to me. The shadow is gone, Watson, he said softly, but its purpose remains fulfilled. And with that, we stepped into the fading light. The truth trailing behind us, like a ghost, finally laid to rest. Chapter 15. The final gathering, the great drawing room of Tilburn Grove, had been prepared with a quiet sense of ceremony. Firelight cast slow amber shadows upon the wood-paneled walls, and the vast oil portrait of Lord Harrogate gazed down with unblinking solemnity upon the room's few remaining occupants. At Holmes's request, every figure touched by the events of the past fortnight was now gathered here. Stephen Tilburn stood by the window, hands folded behind his back, the weight of revelation behind him and the weight of a family's legacy ahead. Clara sat to the right of the hearth, Emily curled beside her. Edgar lingered near the bookcase, silent but composed. Evelyn Sharp stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and beside her, uninvited yet unchallenged, stood Inspector Brighton, come to hear the full reckoning. Holmes stepped forward without flourish, one hand resting gently on the recovered ledger, now placed upon a side table, its green leather binding worn, its truths finally unsealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have asked you here not to revisit pain, but to bring it to its close. Over these past days, we have all pursued the same question in our own way. What truly happened the night Stephen Tilburn vanished? And more importantly, why?" He turned slightly, addressing the group collectively. "The first deception was simple, a misdirection of death. Stephen was not killed, he was silenced. The bruises on the stones, the broken hedge, the disturbed journal pointed not to murder, but escape. And yet, had he left the grove without that final piece, the ledger of this would have unfolded." Holmes lifted the book. "This document is the fulcrum upon which all of Tilburn Grove's secrets balance. Within it lies a record of Lord Harrogate's original will and the embezzlements that followed. Every false heirship, every questionable promotion, every secret alliance is tied back to this." Edgar flinched slightly. "When Stephen discovered the ledger," Holmes continued, "he threatened, perhaps naively, to expose it." Basil panicked. Rupert saw opportunity. Clara, misled by both men, acted out of loyalty to family, choosing secrecy over truth. But none of them anticipated that Stephen would not die, that he would disappear instead. Holmes let the silence stretch, and then came the photograph. He walked to the hearth and lifted the framed print. It was not a warning, not a threat. It was a plea, a message from Stephen, intended for Clara, meant to be seen and understood. A shadow positioned with precision, revealing not only his survival but his awareness. It was his way of returning to the narrative without announcing himself. Clara's breath caught faintly. Holmes faced them all again. Now, to the deeper crime, the second deception. Rupert Denbury, who has since been remanded to London custody, attempted to engineer the perfect collapse of this family. He knew Charles's disappearance would raise questions, so he forged letters and planted the initial CD on the watch used to implicate others. He hoped to create a closed circle of suspicion, one in which everyone but himself appeared guilty. But he was too clever by half. In trying to frame a ghost, he became visible. Inspector Brighton nodded approvingly. "And what of Edgar?" Holmes continued. "He was not complicit in the later schemes, but he hid the ledger, out of fear, out of pride, out of love for Clara, perhaps. His silence made room for greater harm." Edgar stepped forward then, his voice measured but resolute. "I will give my statement in full, Inspector. I ask no leniency." Brighton inclined his head. "We'll speak privately, but I believe Mr. Holmes's words carry weight." Holmes turned once more, now facing Stephen. "And you, sir? You returned not for revenge, but for truth. Yet you misjudged the Grove's capacity for remembrance. Some ghosts come back not to haunt, but to heal, and in doing so, they force others to confront what they buried." Stephen bowed his head. Holmes stepped back from the hearth, folding his hands behind his back. "This, then, is the truth. Lord Harrogate's will was altered. Stephen discovered it. Others, fearing disgrace, sought to silence him. But justice, like memory, does not sleep forever. There was a long pause. Then, unexpectedly, Emily spoke. "So, we're safe now." Holmes looked down at her and smiled gently. "Because your family chose to face the truth. And truth, little one, has a long shadow, but it always leads toward light."